Towards spring, the uncles split up. Yakov stayed in the city while Mikhail went across the river. Grandfather bought himself a large, interesting house in Polyvoy Street with a tavern on the ground floor, built of stone, a tiny, cozy little attic room, and a garden which sloped down to a ravine thickly overgrown with bare, bristling willow shoots. Very good for whips, said Grandfather with a gay wink, as we went together down the soft, thawing paths to inspect the garden. I think I'll start teaching you the alphabet next, something it's time you knew. The whole house was crammed with lodgers. Only the top floor was kept free by Grandfather for himself, and for when he was entertaining. Grandmother took up residence in the attic with me. The window overlooked the street, and if you leant out over the sill, you could see the drunkards in the evening. When there was a holiday, they staggered out of the tavern and tottered along the street, swearing as they fell. Sometimes they were flung out into the street like sacks, only to force their way back in again. The door would slam its screeching hinges. The door would slam, its screeching hinges would make a dreadful grating noise, and a fight usually followed. All this was very amusing to watch from my attic window. Every morning Grandfather would ride off to his son's workshops to help them get things going. He used to return in the evening, tired out, irritable, and depressed. Grandmother would sew, cook, and potter around in the herb and vegetable gardens, dash about the whole day long, just like an enormous top driven by an invisible whip. Take her snuff, sneeze with evident relish, and say, as she wiped her sweaty face, "Praise be God forevermore, we've found peace and quiet at last. Thanks to the Holy Virgin, everything's very peaceful now." But our life there didn't strike me as very peaceful. From morning till late at night, the lodgers' wives bustled around the yard, and now and again neighbors would turn up. All of them were always rushing somewhere, complaining they were late, and were already getting themselves ready for something, and calling out, "Akulina Ivanova," greeting one and all with the same friendly smile and concern. Akulina would push the snuff up her nose with her thumb, meticulously wipe her nose and finger with a red check handkerchief, and say, "If you want to get rid of lice, you should bathe more often and steam yourself with mint vapor. If the lice are under the skin, take a spoonful of purest goose fat, 3 drops of mercury, pound it all up 7 times in a small dish with a piece of china, and smear it on the skin. If you use a wooden spoon or a bone, you'll lose the mercury, and never use copper or silver. It's very harmful." Sometimes she would think hard and say thoughtfully, "My good woman, you'd better go and see Father Asaph at Peccary Monastery. I cannot solve your problem." She was a midwife, sorted out family quarrels and arguments, treated the children when they were ill, and could recite the Virgin's Dream by heart, so the woman could learn it for good luck, and gave them advice on domestic matters. You can tell from the look of the cucumber when it's ready for pickling, as soon as they lose their earthy smell and get their natural smell back. Take them and salt them. If you want good kvass, then you must insult it and make it angry. Kvass can't stand sweet things, so throw in a few raisins or some sugar. A small teaspoonful to a bucket will do. There's different ways of clotting cream. There's the Danubian and Spanish, and even the Caucasian way. All day long I followed her around, whether she was in the garden or in the yard, or went off to a neighbor's house, where she would drink tea for hours, telling her incessant stories. I felt as if I'd been grafted onto her, and can remember nothing else about that time of my life except the indefatigable old woman who never faltered in her kindness. Sometimes my mother would put in a brief appearance. She was proud and stern, and looked upon everything with cold gray eyes, like the winter's sun, and later she quickly disappeared, leaving nothing at all to be remembered by. Once I asked Grandmother, "Are you a witch?" "Whatever next?" she said, bursting out laughing, and then suddenly adding in a serious voice, "How could I be a witch? Witchcraft isn't learned in 5 minutes. Besides, I can't even spell. Don't know A from B. Your grandfather is the one for book learning, but the Holy Virgin didn't bless me with brains." And then she unveiled another part of her life. I was an orphan as well. My mother had nothing and was a cripple. When she was still a young girl, her master did something to frighten her. One night she jumped out of the window from fear and hurt her side and shoulder. and from that time onwards her right hand, the one she used most, withered up. A fine thing for a marvelous lace-maker. Well, she was of no use to her masters now, and they let her go free. Then she had to fend for herself. But how can anyone live without their right hand? So she wandered about, living on charity. In those days, people were better off and kinder. There were the wonderful carpenters and lace makers of Balakna. They made you feel proud. Mother and I used to wander through the towns in autumn and winter, but when the Archangel Gabriel waved his sword, winter was driven away, and spring would come over the earth. Then we would go on further, wherever the fancy took us. We went to Murom and Yurevets, and up the Volga, and along the peaceful Oka. It's marvelous to be in the open in the spring and summer. The ground's warm and soft, the grass like velvet. The Holy Virgin has sprinkled the fields with flowers. It fills you with joy and leaves room for the soul to breathe. Mother was in the habit of half closing her blue eyes and singing so she could be heard high in the heavens. Her voice wasn't strong, but it was clear as a bell, and everything around her would stop and listen, in trance fire. Dear God, it was good to be alive. When I was 9, Mother began to feel ashamed of taking me with her on her wanderings, and thought begging was such a disgrace, that she settled down in Balakna. She dashed from house to house, except on Sundays, when she begged at the church gates. While she was gone, I sat at home, learning as fast as I could how to make lace. I wanted to be a help to Mother, and if something went wrong, the tears would roll down my cheeks. In just over 2 years, mind you, I learnt the art, and became very famous all over the whole town. If anyone wanted anything extra special, they'd come straight to us and say, "Come on, Akulia, get those bobbins moving." And I was so glad. It wasn't like work at all to me. Of course, it wasn't that I was so good, so much as doing what Mother told me. With one hand, she couldn't do very much, but she made up for it by being a very good teacher, and a good teacher is worth more than 10 good workmen. I was so proud and used to say, "You can stop going around begging now, because I can support you." Mother would reply, "Enough of that talk. All the money's being saved up for your dowry." Soon after, grandmother appeared on the scene, and a remarkable grandfather appeared on the scene, and a remarkable young man he was, 22 and already a Foreman Bargee. His mother had singled me out, and she could see I was a worker, and that I was a beggar's daughter, which meant I'd make an obedient wife. Well, she used to sell bread and was a wicked old woman, God rest her soul. Why should we remember the wicked? God has his eye on them without our interfering. He sees what they're doing all right, and the devil loves them. She would laugh with that warm laugh of hers, and it was funny to see her nose twitch. But her eyes, shining and thoughtful, would caress me and tell me more than ever words could. I remember one calm evening I was drinking tea with grandmother in grandfather's room. He was out of sorts and sat on the bed without his shirt, his shoulders covered with a long towel. Every minute he wiped floods of sweat off his forehead, and his breathing was rapid and hoarse. His green eyes had gone dim, his face was swollen and purple, especially his small pointed ears. It was painful to see his hand shake when he reached for a cup of tea. He was in very low spirits, and not at all his usual self. "Why haven't I got any sugar?" he asked grandmother in the capricious voice of a spoiled child. She replied in a friendly but firm voice, "Honey'll do you better." Heaving a breathless sigh, he quickly swallowed his hot tea and said, "Mind I don't die on you." "Don't worry, I'll look after you." "Yes, if I died now, it would be like I never lived at all. Everything would be squandered." "Stop your chattering and lie still." For a minute he said nothing and lay with his eyes closed, smacking his dark lips. Suddenly, as if someone had stuck a pin in him, he shook himself and started pondering aloud. Yashka and Mishka must get married as soon as possible. Perhaps having a wife and children to look after will tame them a bit. He began running over all the names of the people in the town who had eligible daughters. Grandmother didn't interrupt and kept drinking cup after cup. I sat by the window and watched the sun set glowing over the town, turning all the windows of houses red. Grandfather had forbidden me to go into the yard or into the garden because I'd been up to some mischief. Flying beetles hummed around the birches in the garden. The cooper was working away in the yard next door, and somewhere someone was sharpening knives. From the gully which lay beyond the garden came the noise of children scrambling around the dense bushes. I longed to be free, and the sadness of evening poured into my heart. Suddenly, with a loud noise, Grandfather slapped the newish-looking book he'd taken from somewhere against his palm, and called out to me in a lively voice. "Well now, cucumber ears, come here. Sit down, Kalmuck face. Can you see that letter? It's an A. Repeat now. A. B. C. What's this one? B. Right, and this? C. Wrong, it's an A. Look at this. Look, this is D, then E. What's that? G. Good, and this? D. Right, and this? A. Grandmother interrupted. You should be lying down. Quiet, this is just what I need to take my mind off things. Carry on, Alexei. Grandfather put his moist arm around my neck and poked at the letters across my shoulder, keeping the book under my nose. He smelt hot, of vinegar, sweat, and baked onion, which nearly suffocated me. He flew into a temper, made a hoarse wheezing noise, and shouted into my ear, "People! Earth!" These words were well known to me, but the Slavonic letters didn't correspond to them. The letter E looked like a worm, the letter G made me think of the humpbacked Grigory, and the letter Ya reminded me of myself with grandmother, while grandfather had something in common with all the letters. He made me slave for a long time over the alphabet and forced me to repeat the letters in and out of sequence. His warm passion infected me, and I broke out sweating as well and shouted as loud as I could. This made him laugh, and he would cough, clutch at his chest, crumple up the book, and say hoarsely, "Mother, he's a clever boy, isn't he?" "You plague from Astrakhan, what are you shouting about?" "You're the one who's shouting." I loved to watch the two of them. Grandmother, her elbows on the table and her cheeks propped up by her fists, would watch us, laugh softly, and say, "You'll do yourself an injury by all that shouting." Grandfather would explain in a friendly tone, "I'm shouting because I'm ill. What have you got to shout about then?" He would shake his wet head and say to grandmother, "Natalia was wrong when she said he had a bad memory. He's got a memory like a horse. Let's have some more, snubby nose." Finally he would playfully push me off the bed. "That's enough. You can keep the book. Tomorrow I want to hear the whole alphabet without any mistakes. If you get it right, I'll give you 5 kopecks. When I reached for the book, he drew me to him again and said gloomily, "What did your mother have to leave you for?" Grandmother gave a start. "Don't say things like that." "I wouldn't have, but it makes me feel so bad. It has to come out sometimes. Oh, when I think of the mess that girl's got herself into." He roughly pushed me away. "Go and play, but not in the street, only in the yard, or the garden.